Hey y'all, welcome to my Xiangling guide as of Genshin Impact 4.6. Xiangling is OP. Yes, I am part of the hive mind, but for this character, that is really the only line of thought. Xiangling is still one of the best characters in the game due to her damage coming from off-field, the wide variety of teams you could slot her into, how easy she is to build, and the fact you get her for free after clearing a low floor of the Spiral Abyss. With that said, in this guide, I'll be covering all of that and more about Xiangling. So let's swing into it like a Pyronado, starting with her talents. Xiangling's normal attack is basically garbage and only used to trigger normal attack based effects. So, moving on. Xiangling's elemental skill, Guoba Attack, is the second most relevant ability in her moveset. On cast, Xiangling summons Guoba, this cooking god that's taken the shape of a bear, that will periodically breathe fire and apply pyro to nearby enemies. Thing is though, the targets of this fire breath are random and do not prioritize the enemy that you're hitting. It does do about the same as one hit of her burst when it does hit the right enemy, but really its main purpose is as a small source of energy regeneration for her burst. Speaking of, Pyronado, the core reason of why Xiangling is so OP in the first place. On cast, Xiangling will summon a boomerang that circles around and follows your active character, dealing AoE pyro damage. This Pyronado will last for a base duration of 10 seconds with a 20-second cooldown. Now, everything sounds great except for that last part, but trust me, it will all sound great soon. This ability is one of the strongest in the game, bar none. It does insane amounts of damage due to the main part of the ability not having elemental ICD, meaning that it can trigger reactions like Vaporize with every hit instead of every 3 hits or 2.5 seconds with regular ICD. It can do its damage from off-field and can abuse snapshotting, which I'll get into in the techniques section. This ability does have the caveat of the 10-second base duration and its 80 energy cost, along with Xiangling generally being extremely energy hungry. But all in all, the pros of this ability significantly outweigh the cons. Let's move on to Xiangling's passives. Xiangling's first Ascension passive increases the range of Guoba's attack. Pretty simple buff that lets Guoba hit more enemies. Xiangling's fourth Ascension passive is mostly a nothing burger, but it's a nice buff nonetheless. When Guoba's attacks end, it drops a pepper where it disappeared. Running into that pepper will give your on-field character a 10% attack buff for 10 seconds. Small, but nice if you happen to pick it up. With all that in mind, which talent should you level first? As if I needed to tell you more, 100% prioritize leveling her burst first, as that is the majority of her damage and the reason behind this Xiangling Impact meme. Next, level up her elemental skill since it can do similar damage to her burst. Lastly, save your talent books instead of using them on her normal attack talent, since it basically contributes nothing. Alright, you know what she does. But how do you get yours to be cracked like everyone says she is? Let's get into the build, starting with her artifacts. Xiangling's big problem is energy management. Since her burst is the most important part of her moveset, you'll want to have it active every time you can. Because that is the case, the best artifact set for Xiangling is the 4-piece set of Emblem of Severed Fate. Look, I get that this domain can seem like an eternal purgatory, but let's face it, half the characters you want to build want this set. Both set bonuses play to Xiangling's weaknesses and strengths. It gives a 20% boost to energy recharge on the 2 set and a burst damage bonus based on 25% of your total energy recharge. Since most characters will appreciate having a set of this for themselves, this will be the artifact domain you'll be living in for a while longer. Besides Emblem, here are some other sets you can use in the meantime. Starting off is the 4-piece set of Crimson Witch of Flames. It gives a pyro damage bonus and an effect that buffs all pyro-related reactions. A pretty decent set if you've got one laying around. Next is the 4-piece set of Gilded Dreams, an 80 EM buff on the 2-set effect, and an extra EM or attack buff when she triggers reactions depending on what elements you have in your party. Turns out to be comparable to the 4-set of Crimson Witch, but in a much more efficient domain because it's paired with Deepwood Memories. The third set I'll mention is the 4-piece of Flower of Paradise Lost. This is only a good option in Burgeon teams, but even though I say that, it is grossly inefficient to farm unless you have an animal DPS you want to build. Lastly, any mix of pyro damage bonus, ER, EM, attack, or burst damage sets can hold you over until you get a 4-piece set of Emblem. Basically, everything I mentioned after Emblem of Severed Fate are holdover sets until you can get a 4-piece of Emblem. It does the most damage while being the best one to farm as well. Now that you realize you're basically stuck in Emblem Hell for another year, let's go over what stats you want on those artifacts, starting with the main stats. On her sands, Xiangling has a few options that can change depending on the team or weapon you use with her. That being the case, Xiangling will want EM, ER, or attack on her sands. If you're using an ER substat weapon like the catch, EM or attack sands are better. ER sands is better for any other scenario or if you're having trouble getting her burst back on cooldown. Past that, EM and attack sands will perform similarly to each other in vaporized teams, and attack will stand out more in mono pyro or non-reaction teams. Next up is her goblet. Pyro damage bonus is the clear winner to improve her damage. Lastly, for her circlet, Xiangling wants crit percent, whichever crit you need more of. In terms of your substat focus on her, first, Xiangling will want ER, enough to where you can comfortably burst with her every rotation, which can go into extreme territories. While we're on the subject, let's go over how much ER she will generally want. Xiangling's ER requirement can drastically vary depending on what team you're running with her and the weapon she's holding. For example, when using her with Bennett and funneling energy back into Xiangling, you could be looking at energy requirements as low as basically nothing with Contained Crossspear, or close to 300% in the worst case scenario. To top it off, Guoba's energy regeneration is both weak and inconsistent, so relying on it is a big no. Even though this chart should give a rough idea of how much she needs, there are still a few assumptions about how you play that don't make it the most accurate. That being said, it still does serve as a good general guideline for how much energy recharge Xiangling wants. The next stats you want to be looking out for is crit percent, then attack, or EM. So now you've got her artifacts down. What weapons are good for her? Xiangling has a wide range of weapon choices to either help her with her weaknesses or superpower her strengths, so let's go through them. And what better one to start with than one of her best while also being completely free? The catch. Yes, you have to fish for it, but this is one of the best weapons for Xiangling, even compared to some of the 5-star ones. It gives a nice hefty amount of energy recharge once it's leveled, and when refined, which I should remind you is also free, it gives a significant burst damage bonus along with burst crit rate to make building her a lot easier. All this value and not a single dime needs to be spent. The absolute most this weapon will cost you is your sanity for the fishing mechanic. But if you really don't want to fish at all, let's go through the rest of her good options. Starting with the Contained Crossspear, the craftable weapon from Inazuma. This weapon will refund some energy to the wielder once they land an elemental skill hit, which is Guoba in this case. This makes it a pretty decent weapon for Xiangling to lower her ER requirements by a fair amount. Moving on to the 4-star gacha or paid category, first up is the Favonius Lance. While it may not directly buff her damage, the extra flat energy she can give herself and the rest of your team when she lands a crit is an appreciated buff for smoother rotations. Second is the Dragon's Bane. Dragon's Bane can end up doing similar or more damage than the catch in Vaporized team if energy is not the primary concern for your setup. Not only that, but because the secondary stat is EM, it is great for buffing burgeon damage as well. Third is the Wavebreaker's Fin. This weapon will do better the higher your party's burst cost, generally better at higher refinements, but can make for a good option if you have it. Lastly, for the 4-star weapons are the ones you can get from the Battle Pass. Deathmatch can make for a good option for the large crit rate on it, but will generally be worse than the other Battle Pass weapon, the Ballad of the Fjords. Ballad of the Fjords gives a smaller crit rate secondary stat, but it gives an EM buff to the wielder depending on how many elements are on the team, scaling up to 240 at max refinement. Pretty simple buff that you can easily activate, since most vaporized teams will generally consist of Hydro, Pyro, and Animal characters anyways. Next, let's move on to her 5-star options. Now, I'm only going to list a few since the catch should be seen as her baseline weapon because of how easy it is to obtain as well as how powerful it is. That being the case, let's start off with the Engulfing Lightning. If you do not have Raiden, Engulfing Lightning can be a very good option for Xiangling, but especially in teams without Bennett. This weapon lets you build for more ER on her while not losing as much damage thanks to the ER to attack conversion. Not to mention, it also gives extra ER for 12 seconds after you cast her burst. Second is the Staff of Homa. It gives a nice crit damage secondary stat along with an HP to attack conversion. Not much more than that since you don't exactly want her to go under 50% HP in a team that doesn't involve Farina. However, if you have other pole-arm DPS characters, you might be better off putting this on them instead at R1. It will do about the same damage as the catch. Last but not least is Xiangling's current best weapon, the Staff of the Scarlet Sands. Gives a huge crit rate secondary stat and an EM to attack conversion. This weapon is fantastic because it perfectly synergizes with most of her playstyles. Note about this weapon is that it's not worth trying to stack its passive at all, but it is her best option regardless. If you don't have Scion or quite frankly, don't use him, give it to her. And those are good weapons for Xiangling. Let's move on to her constellations and see if you should be pulling for them. Xiangling's constellations can either be really good or completely useless. Unfortunately, most of them are closer to being useless, but let's get into them regardless. C1 makes Guoba more useful. Enemies hit by Guoba's attack will have their pyro resistance reduced by 15% for 6 seconds. Nice and simple buff overall. Can be more noticeable in teams where you don't have another source of pyro resistance shred, like from 4th-piece Viridescent. Xiangling's C2 is a bit odd, but useless nonetheless. After landing the final hit of her normal attack sequence, she'll apply a status that, after 2 seconds, will trigger an explosion that does AoE pyro damage. You're never seeing this in practical use. Even if you forced it, the damage it does isn't worth the effort. C3 and 5 give 3 talent levels to her burst and skill respectively, both very nice damage buffs. Xiangling's C4 is a big one. Not in its description, but in its effect. C4 will elongate the duration of Pyronado by 40%. Remember how I specifically mentioned that Pyronado has a base duration of 10 seconds? Well, this constellation makes that 14 seconds. That makes this Xiangling's most important constellation, extending the uptime of the ability that has the most damage contribution, which also means lowering its downtime? Yeah, that's broken. Xiangling's C6 is a bit underwhelming for herself. For the duration of Pyronado, all party members will get a 15% pyro damage bonus. This mostly serves to buff Guoba's damage if you use her burst then skill. Besides that, it can be a nice buff for other pyro teammates if they're also doing their own damage. To cap off on Xiangling's constellations, C3 and C4 are absolutely some of the best ones, letting her burst do a lot more damage with those extra 4 seconds. The rest of her constellations are very useless or middling at best. With the constellations out of the way, let's talk about some mechanics she has in her moveset. Let's start with snapshotting. Certain abilities in this game have this hidden mechanic attached to them. When you cast an ability that can snapshot, it takes all relevant stat buffs from the moment it was cast and carries them throughout the entirety of its duration. If you didn't get that, try to think of it as if you were to take a screenshot of your character's stats as soon as you cast an ability. Those stats would be what your abilities scale off of for the rest of the duration. So what am I trying to say with this explanation? Xiangling's best teammate is Bennett. Bennett gives a substantial attack buff with his burst, along with more pyro damage bonus if you decide to C6 him, which you should really do at this point. Xiangling can then snapshot the attack buff for both her skill and burst, and they can keep the massive buffs even if Xiangling is not in the inspiration field. Let's not forget, it was mainly these two that coined the term Circle Impact. The other tip I want to mention is Guoba Swirl. As the name suggests, Guoba can be swirled as a source of pyro. When it attacks, there is a brief moment where it self-infuses with pyro, letting you swirl it to trigger any swirl-based buffs. This is mainly a mechanic for Sucrose to abuse, to catch up with Kazuha's buffing potential, since he has easier ways of triggering those buffs. How you do this is by timing her skill as soon as Guoba attacks. Through this, you should see a greater EM increase on Xiangling if you did it correctly. Now, let's get into Xiangling's best teams. Since Xiangling's ability to do damage isn't limited by having to stay on field, she can pretty much fit in anywhere you would want a pyro damage dealer. So let's go through them. Reverse Vaporize is Xiangling's bread and butter team archetype. With fast enough Hydro applicators, her burst can trigger Vaporize due to it having no ICD. This team generally wants Bennett, a Hydro slot, and a free slot. The Hydro slot in itself is also really flexible in who's good for it. Tartaglia, Ayato, Novulet, Kokomi, Xingqiu, Yelan, or Farina are all great for setting up Hydro. As for the free slot, you can run an offensive support like another buffer, Zhongli for added safety, another Hydro character to consistently have Xiangling be the Vaporize trigger, or a Cryo character to trigger occasional freezes for Xiangling to trigger a mix of Vaporize and Melt. Good offensive supports are Kazuha, Sucrose, Hazel, and Venti due to them being able to abuse the 4-piece Viridescent Venerer set along with some of their own passives. Albedo can also make for a good choice for the off-field damage and EM buff after using his burst. For the Cryo slot, your main picks are Ridley, Kaya, or Ayaka. Here are some example teams. Tartaglia, Xiangling, Kazuha, Bennett is Xiangling's top Vaporize team, also known as International. Since Tartaglia still has the fastest Hydro application in the game to date, that makes him a no-brainer to set up Vaporizes for Pyronado. Kazuha can also be replaced by Sucrose if you don't have him. The second possible team is with Xingqiu and Yelan, where they can generate energy for each other, apply Hydro from off-field using normal attacks, and Yelan's stacking damage buff that goes up over time. Last one is a Vape Melt team, having Farina and Wriothesley. Farina's Hydro application is a bit awkward in timing, leaving some room for Wriothesley to apply Cryo and have Xiangling trigger both Vaporize and Melt. The second archetype is Reverse Melt. Since Xiangling's Pyronado itself is a really good source of Pyro application, you can use it for Cryo characters to trigger Melt. The general team structure is a Cryo DPS and a free slot. Main picks for the Cryo DPS slot are Kaya, Rosaria, Wriothesley, and Ganyu. For the free slot, you can choose a defensive support or another buffer for your Cryo character. Good picks for the buffer slot are Shenhe, Changyan, Rosaria, C6 Diona for her extra healing, shielding, and EM buff, or Layla for her shields. An example is one with Rosaria and Changyan, a team composed entirely out of 4 stars, making it really inexpensive to build, and it's also really easy to operate. Just spam skill bursts. Last one I'll touch on is Ganyu and Zhongli. Ganyu's charge shot deals some of the most single instance damage in the game, and with this team, she gets to melt those as well as having ample healing and protection to help her with that. And hey, if you just want to do away with all these reaction-based teams, you can do that. Xiangling's own damage is already ridiculous as it is that you hardly need reactions at all and can strictly focus on maximizing pyro damage with a mono pyro team. The team structure generally involves another pyro unit and a flexible slot for another support. Most of the pyro cast will be good for that third pyro slot, and at that point, the flexible slot can be a defensive or offensive support depending on your preferences. You can run a Lineage team with him and Zhongli, or a plunge spam team with Gaming and Shen Yun. Honestly, most of everything can work here. With version 4.3 came the release of Chevras, and even more importantly, the viability of Overloaded because of her. Well, that's actually hyperbole. The actual reaction still sucks. It's more of the lesser damage loss when deciding to use a Pyro Electro team. That said though, Chevras is a must for this archetype, or else it crumbles apart. Besides that, pick 1 or 2 Electro characters and or another Pyro. I just mentioned some team archetypes with reactions, but really, the Xiangling plus Bennett combo is so strong that they can be slotted in almost anywhere and everywhere, but I mentioned those specific reaction teams so you could get a good idea of some of the best ones. Now that we've gone through what Xiangling's strongest teams are, let's do a showcase to show you how and why they're good. For this showcase, I'll be using Xiangling at level 90 with a level 90 catch at Refinement rank 5, level 13 burst, C6 with a 4-piece of Emblem of Severed Fate. Here is the build. Let's get into the showcase. Roll the clips.
Let your guard down.
Here comes the test. Witness the power go wild. Rain outlines your fate. Everybody stand back. Eat this. Let me lead you a place. Rain outline the. Let's light it up. Nice and spicy. Busted. Nice and spicy.
Solidify.
Everybody stand back. You're toast.
Stabilize.
Nice and spicy. Everybody stand back. Born of ice and frost.
Solidify.
Going in. Let's light it up. Nice and spicy.
Let's wrap up this guide because this is looking like a 10-page script. Xiangling is the quintessential pyro unit for almost all of your damage needs, coming completely free and easy to build with some amazing scalings on her talents to boot. She does have the downside of being extremely energy hungry, but it's a worthy sacrifice for the amount of damage she can do. For more details, check out the KeqingMains Guides linked below the like button. Thanks for watching, and I hope to see you back for another video. See ya.